Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Okay, today is a controversial one. Today's a little bit of a touchy subject, but you know what? We got to talk about touchy subjects because if you're invested in companies that are doing things and that the public feels are doing certain interesting things and choose to cover them in certain negative ways, it's important to really get context. If you're going to be an investor, if you're going to sleep well at night with the investments that you make, you need to be able to stomach and reconcile some of those things those companies are doing, even if you may disagree with them, and try to understand the nuance. Try to really understand that it's not black, it's not white, it is very gray when companies operate and when companies do business, because that is the nature of business and ethics. Palantir has long been criticized for its association with ICE, or Immigration's Customs Enforcement, which is a branch of an agency of Homeland Security, part of the federal government, that basically operates to do a lot of different things. And we're going to talk about a lot of those things today because a lot of times Palantir gets painted in a very negative light for his working with ICE. And it's incredibly important to understand why they get painted in a negative light, what is some of the truth or falsity that exists within how they get painted in a negative light, and ultimately understand what they're doing and how they choose to make the decisions for the clients that they work with. Palantir's involvement with ICE is really misinterpreted a lot of times. They are not this company that just partnered with the Trump presidency to just go round up kids and put them in cages. Like, that is a weird way to think about it, especially if you don't know the history about ICE and if you just read the headlines. And we need to dive deep, actually look to nuance, and then actually understand what are the best other alternatives that would allow this to make sense. And if we don't look at those alternatives and we just rush to the headlines that Palantir is the worst company in the world because they've worked with ICE, we really destroy the opportunity to have a nuanced discussion and a nuanced understanding as anyone, forget an investor, over why a company is doing what it's doing. So here's a clip from Ryan Biermeister, the Senior Vice President of Product for Government. We're going to watch her talk about it. It's about 2-3 minutes. I'm not going to interrupt the clip while it's going. I want you to understand it and you to watch it as long as it goes. And then after that, we're going to do our analysis.
There's been so much controversy about, in particular, your contract with ICE and other government contracts. Why, I mean, I guess as just a starting point, for a question, why do you choose to do business with an agency like ICE? This has been, linked to workplace raids and deportation. So,
I mean, our values and our mission, we take on clients that align with that. And that mission is democracy, it is national security, it is those things in conjunction with privacy and civil liberties. And I think we all live in a pretty polarized climate right now. Society is heavily cleavaged, and I think it means that people rush to various sides of debates and think of them in very black and white ways, as opposed to appreciating nuance. So for the ICE question specifically, the Obama administration brought us to ICE in 2011 for something called Operation Fallen Hero, which was an ICE agent was murdered across the border while sitting in his vehicle by 12 people. And the Obama administration called us to ask if we could help them integrate that data and figure out who was responsible for it. We ultimately were able to apprehend that individual. And the contract from there was with Homeland Security Investigations, which is a distinct group from ICE. They're not directly responsible for enforcement or worksite enforcement, and they mostly do transnational crime. And so that is things like narco trafficking or human trafficking, El Chapo Guzman cases, child exploitation. And I've seen some pretty horrific but inspiring cases where ICE has done things like put 3,000 child sex traffickers in jail in 2018 alone.
Do you have the ability as a vendor to this agency? Do you have the ability to say, because I think nobody would argue that's good, right? But do you have the ability to say to them, we will sell you to this technology for these applications, but not for these ones?
Again, we work with HSI, which is a distinct group. But no, I mean, like, we support the American government. I think our CEO has said many times that Silicon Valley shouldn't be the people who are picking winners and losers. We live in a democracy. We want that democracy to be self-correcting. Many people at Palantir, myself included, have rigorous debate and have many discussions and disagreements about this. But we ultimately think that the impact and the mission of HSI in particular is important enough, 3,000 child predators and 850 kids being saved because of our work, that it's worth sticking with the government in this instance.
So would it be fair to sum up and say that, in your view, the good outweighs the bad of what the technology is doing?
I think what I'm trying to say is that we don't work for political parties or administrations. We work for democratic institutions and institutions that impact the lives of many people. And we think that our technology is better. Those institutions are better with our technology. Privacy is more protected. They are more deliberate. They're more effective than otherwise.
All right, a couple of key arguments there. Let's actually break them down and let's actually analyze them. So what's the first thing that Ryan says? Number one, Palantir was contracted by the Obama administration in 2011. So first of all, the narrative going around really since over the past couple of years that Palantir works with the Trump or the Trump president. So the narrative is Trump is evil. Trump's presidency wanted to go lock up kids, and therefore they hired Palantir to work with them in order to go lock up these kids. Again, that takes away a lot of nuance. And again, these aren't my political opinions. That's just kind of the narrative that's been portrayed for how Palantir operates in relationship to the Trump presidency during that time with ICE. The Obama administration was like, hey, this guy who works for the U.S. federal government was killed by a bunch of people that were crossing the border, doing bad things, illegal immigrants. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again. And we need data-driven solutions. These are, again, really hard, complex problems to solve. These are not easy things. I just did an analysis of Shyam Sankar, who gave a TED Talk, and he's obviously Palantir's COO, and he was doing a really good job in that TED Talk actually explaining how companies need to solve big data problems. And if you've ever been confused about what does it mean for a company to solve a big data problem, watch that TED Talk and the analysis of it, because it really explains what it means. He breaks down really simple analogies for how data problems need to be able to be solved and why they're so complex. This you're talking about on a whole nother level. You're trying to find these people that are illegal immigrants that you know nothing about, just some data points about where it actually happened, that killed somebody, and you need to go figure out how to resolve and make sure that doesn't happen again. So the Obama administration called on Palantir in 2011. That's the first thing to understand here. There's nuance. The Obama administration are Democrats, right? They're not Republicans. So again, this whole idea that there's this right-wing like conspiracy to work with technology companies that are creating all these unethical things in the world, that also doesn't make any sense, because a lot of these organizations, or a lot of what Palantir's work was with the federal government, started back in 2011. The second argument she makes here is that work that was done was a division of Homeland Security. So the actual enforcement agency of ICE that is going to like go find kids and round them up, and this was the stuff happening in the headlines in 2018, 2019, where there was some pretty horrific stuff. I mean, putting kids in cages, that's like not what we probably want to do as a society. That's not a good look for America, etc. That's not specifically the agency that Palantir was working with. That is a subdivision of ICE. ICE is a lot more bigger than just this one organization. It is a subdivision of the Homeland Security Division, or Homeland Security, which meant Palantir was working with them writ large. Their entire technology was integrated throughout a lot of those agencies, but it's not like they were exclusively contracted, and that's sort of Ryan's point, that there was a contract with Homeland Security, not just a contract with one subsidiary of an enforcement agency just to go do one specific task that was claimed in the headlines in 2018, 2019. The third argument here is that a lot of the work was really good. And this is the conversation about ethics in business that is very important to have. It's very important to have if you are an investor that's investing in companies, because as I did in my Ross Gerber analysis, who's turning into a little bit of the Gordon Johnson of Palantir, his argument was like, Palantir mines data. Mining your data is bad. Like they're trying to like surveil you, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, A, a lot of those things were false. But B, he's citing this corporate responsibility, right? This idea of ESG, this idea that a company has to be ethical. And my response to Ross, and I actually tweeted to him the other day, is like, well, how do you reconcile some of the unethical things that your top holdings do, like Apple using sweatshop labor to make their iPhones? Why can you stomach that because their stock price goes up, but because you're not in Palantir, you can't stomach their problems? These are nuanced discussions, and there's not a right or wrong, but there is nuance to be had here. So when you're able to stop narcotics from crossing borders, and you're also able to stop child sex trafficking and overall human trafficking, that's a good thing. Like, as you can see, as the interviewer said, it's like, that's pretty much an objectively good thing. No one would argue against that, right? So that's one thing to think about. Those aren't reported in the headlines, that this technology platform is actually saving people from being sexually assaulted and abused across border lines, and stopping drugs from entering in certain places that's causing a lot of violence and crime. Like, those things need to be resolved. And the beautiful thing about technology is that technology is innovative enough to find effective, fast mechanisms to be able to resolve those things, because the people who are dying from those things, the people that are being affected from those things, they don't have time to wait. Like, if you have solutions to those problems, you should probably solve them. And the final argument she makes here is about civil liberties. So we've seen Palantir talk about civil liberties a lot. Palantir is one of the only technology companies that works with the federal government that actually is able to monitor and protect, not only from the culture of the company, from the philosophy of the company, from the literal technology of the company, civil liberties. Meaning, when data is integrated into the federal government, into the CIA, into the FBI, and they know a lot of stuff about a lot of people that is highly confidential, how do you know those agencies aren't going to misuse that data? How do you know those agencies aren't going to use that data in a way that is counterproductive or essentially surveilling the individuals that they have that data on? That's where technology comes in. And the sort of bull case here for Palantir in the context of civil liberties is if there wasn't a technology company, another third-party vendor that was providing the service that had civil liberties protections at the core DNA of its technology, and I've done some videos on this, I'll leave it in the description, but this is the nature of why Palantir was even created in the first place, then the government would have full control over it, right? They would have a tyrannical authoritarian control over how they integrate data, how they understand data, and ultimately how they control data. And we know the government is not a technology company, right? The government doesn't know really what to do. In fact, when Palantir caught Bernie Madoff, I did a video on that a couple weeks ago, the literal article that I was reading said that the United States' own military software to try to like fight crime and financial crime that cost $2.3 billion to create was not as good as Palantir, right? So like the government itself already admitted that Palantir stuff is way better. And when the government is admitting that, and that means Palantir has some leverage, right? So if the government is admitting that Palantir's technology is way better than the stuff we paid billions of dollars to create internally, and Palantir has the ability to protect civil liberties, that's a win-win for both sides, because the government doesn't want to like do a lot of bad stuff. It's just that if the government doesn't have controls, checks and balances, they're inevitably going to do bad stuff. That's the nature of a democracy. That's why we have Democrats and Republicans, so one side doesn't go crazy. So if Palantir has technology that is able to help the government become more fast, effective, and efficient and solve these problems that exist, and Palantir is able to protect civil liberties, that makes the government look good, but that also makes people feel safe at night, knowing that a technology company is working with the federal government to make sure data can't be misused. You know, Google has this saying of like, don't be evil. There's a world in which Palantir can't be evil because the technology that they're using doesn't allow it to be evil because of the protections for civil liberties. So Palantir's whole argument is like, we're not Democrats or Republicans. We're not here to ideologically impose the belief of the CEO of a couple thousand person company and a incredibly complex software onto what's going on in the country. Our job is to say, okay, the country democratically elected this person, and this person is administrating their policies. If we as a company choose to stop working and impose ideological beliefs, that means that government can't trust us. And that means that ultimately we are becoming a monopoly on the technology that we have and ideologically imposing that monopoly in different ways. A lot of those ways can be problematic because then when that presidency leaves and the next presidency comes into place and you kind of like as a company agree with his positions more than the other positions, that signals that you're not really a company that is able to be trusted or work with. And one of Alex Karp's biggest arguments that he makes is like, if you're a soldier in a war and you're wearing a Palantir suit, you gotta be sure that you can trust that suit, right? You can't say that, oh, I can only trust this suit if Joe Biden or Barack Obama is the president. Like, you have to be able to trust that suit, meaning you have to be able to work with a government or a company that is politically neutral and that is able to just build the best technology that is possible. This also means that Silicon Valley companies that don't work with the US federal government, that stands up for Western democratic values, but then work for other nations that are adversaries of democratic values, i.e. the sort of Apple argument about creating all your iPhones in sweatshops in China versus like bringing those wages to the United States and bringing those jobs to the United States, or then not working with the government when they need you to do certain things. That becomes a contradiction between business and ethics. And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong here, but there is nuance. So for Palantir to have left ICE in 2017, 2018, because they disagreed with what they were doing. And by the way, there's a good clip of Alex Karp vehemently disagreeing with some of the stuff ICE did in 2018, 2019. I'll leave that in the description. Like, he was not a fan of it because politically he voted for Hillary Clinton. Like, he is a progressive on the progressive left. he still understands the foundational element of when you build a company and a technology that works with institutions that need to be able to trust your product. You can't just walk away when you don't agree with what the company is doing. That doesn't allow a company to actually be a company in the first place. And at that point, you do have to do some good outweighs the bad stuff. Because if you can objectively agree that some of the stuff that our product is used to be able to do is bad in certain ways, or it doesn't feel the best, but a lot of the stuff it's used to do is really good stuff, how do you weigh between those things? A lot of times companies just have to be utilitarian and figure out this outweighs this matters more. Even though some of these things are bad, we're going to try to minimize that stuff by stopping the civil liberties, by making sure we integrate a lot of technology and privacy into what we're doing. But at the end of the day, the government is the government that is selected by the people. And if the people select a government to administer certain policies democratically, that government has to be respected, because in a democratic society, there's nothing we can do other than respect the rule of law and the fact that democracy exists in order for people to be able to make decisions freely and have those decisions count by a majority vote in a society. If we don't have that, we have authoritarianism, and then nothing really is democratic in the first place. And this is what I mean by business and ethics are incredibly complicated, right? So like, if the government is doing something bad and they're doing something bad using an iPhone, or they're using Google to search for certain things in order for them to do something that's like objectively bad, are Google and Apple responsible at that point? Like, should Google stop licensing its search engine to the government, even though they don't do that, right? It's just a random website, in order for this to happen? Like, these are complicated questions. Should Apple not sell phones to immigrant customs enforcement officers because they don't want their phones to be used by these people, because those people are going to be communicating with those phones to do bad things? Like, these are kind of the really important questions to think about. Now, Palantir, you may argue, okay, Palantir is a direct software that's working with these people to do direct things, but then Palantir is also working with all these other subdivisions of the government, all these other divisions and subsidiaries that are doing all these good things. And how do you reconcile this? Just like a lot of people in the government are using their iPhones to do a lot of good things, right? Not just bad things. So this discussion is nuanced here, right? And it's really important to understand that if a company is trying to protect civil liberties, meaning they're trying to create technology that doesn't violate people and their data while working with institutions that have the ability and have shown the ability to violate people and their data, and that company is creating technology that is only working with democratically elected institutions, meaning they're not taking this very complex and potentially abusable technology to Russia and China and all the other places that have known to do massive human rights violations. They're not working with them. And you have a company that has empirically been able to show that they can use their data to find bad things that are happening, like human traffickers, and stop them in sight. And they're politically neutral, because they're not saying we're not going to work with Obama because he's a Democrat, or we're going to work with Trump because he's a Republican. We're just going to work with the institution that is democratically elected in the first place. Then you've got a company that is very different from a lot of other Silicon Valley companies. And you've also got a company that actually has culture, actually has a mission, and actually has values. And I think that's the key takeaway to understand from this. When people just say, oh, they worked with ICE, they're a bad company, they don't understand the nuance. They don't understand the good things that they've done. They don't understand how their software is integrated with the entire federal government and how certain subdivisions use it and don't use it. And they also don't understand that in business, things are complicated when you try to mix ethics into it. And there are a lot of loopholes, and there are a lot of ways and a lot of cost-benefit analysis and a lot of philosophical discussions that people need to have in order to come to these conclusions. It's not as black as white as saying something is good or something is bad. The good outweighs the bad if there is a bad. And there are bads for a lot of different companies. The question becomes, what is the good that they're doing? And ultimately, are they going to still work with an institution that is more democratically elected, or are they going to take their product away, not be trustworthy, not protect civil liberties, have that government do a bunch of other things that ends up being worse, and then go work with adversarial companies or countries like most Silicon Valley tech companies do, but don't get the blame for it because those things are hush-hush, i.e. Apple working with China to create these iPhones, versus working with the federal government where the public and the media and the New York Times will like blast you if you're doing some bad things. That's the nuance here to have, and that's the important thing to consider when you're thinking about a company's relationship when it comes to business ethics and ESG. So those are my thoughts on this. Palantir has worked with ICE in the past. They may be working with ICE in the future. It's important to understand how a technology is integrated within a government. It's important to understand how the government is actually using that technology. And it's important to understand all of the good things that come out of a company working with the government a company that's creating proprietary software that is actually complex enough to protect people and their liberties and their privacy. And it's important to understand what it means for a company to be politically neutral and not impose their own ideological beliefs on a democratic elected institution. I think that's the sort of biggest point here. And if you're able to understand that and able to understand that nuance, then this conversation gets a lot more understandable versus just headline driven, which is what I think it mostly is a lot of times, not just with Palantir, but with a lot of other companies. So hopefully this discussion gave a little bit more of my thoughts on what it means for business and ethics to coincide and what it means for a company to actually reconcile some of these hard issues that every company has to deal with, because business is complicated and being a good steward of the environment is complicated and being ethical is also very complicated.